There is a people that does not fit on the map. Not the geographical one, but the historical one. A people who lived right on the threshold of Rome, breathed the same air, walked the same hills, but spoke a language that no one in Europe could understand. A people who taught the Romans to build arches, lay roads, read the signs of the gods in the flight of birds, and then disappeared so quietly as if the earth itself had swallowed their name. They were called the Etruscans, and for 2,500 years, no one could say with certainty where they came from. For many generations, the story seemed resolved, clean, convenient, almost too simple. There were two main versions, and both had authoritative defenders since antiquity. The first belonged to Herodotus, the Greek historian who was called the father of history. He wrote that the Etruscans came from Lydia, from the western coast of Asia Minor, fleeing a terrible famine. Their king, according to Herodotus, divided the people in half, cast lots, and one half boarded ships and sailed west. They landed on the Italian coast and founded a new homeland, a new language, a new world. It sounded like a legend, but it was a legend repeated for centuries. It was accepted by philosophers, poets, geographers. It was retold by Roman authors. It was carved into the stone of memory. The second version belonged to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who lived much later. He claimed the exact opposite. The Etruscans, in his opinion, did not come from anywhere. They had always been in Italy. They were an indigenous people who emerged on the spot, from local roots, from the local land. Their language was incomprehensible because it was older than all the others, a relic from the times when Indo-European tribes had not yet covered Europe with their wave. And so, for 2,000 years, historians, archaeologists, and linguists were divided into two camps. Some saw the Etruscans as newcomers from the east. Others saw them as the most ancient inhabitants of the Apennines. Both sides had arguments. Both sides had their evidence. Both sides were confident. But there was one detail that never fit: the Etruscan language. It resembled nothing. Not Latin, not Greek, not Celtic. Not a single one of the languages of the great Indo-European family that stretched from Ireland to India. It stood apart, like an island in the middle of the ocean. Its alphabet resembled Greek, but the words it formed did not belong to any known language on the continent. Archaeologists found thousands of inscriptions, short ones, funerary ones, religious ones. Most of them could be read letter by letter, but it was never possible to understand them completely. The Etruscan language gave scientists enough to tease, but too little to reveal itself fully. And if the language was so alien, logic suggested that the people must have come from somewhere far away. Perhaps Herodotus was right. Perhaps these people really did appear from across the sea, bringing with them a language that no one else remembered. This was thought for a long time, a very long time. The version of Eastern origin seemed elegant, poetic, almost inevitable. The Etruscans built tombs similar to the tombs of Anatolia. They divined by the entrails of animals, as was done in Mesopotamia. Their aristocrats lay on banquet couches next to their wives, as the Lydians and Phrygians did. Their art loved Eastern motifs: lions, griffins, bizarre creatures with wings and tails. Everything pointed to the east. Everything except one detail that long remained unnoticed: bones. In the earth layers of Tuscany, in the mounds of Caere, in the necropolises of Tarquinia and Vulci, lay those who once built the Etruscan cities. Their skeletons waited for thousands of years, waited for the time when science would finally be able to ask them a question that no one living could answer. And this time did not come yesterday. It came when laboratories learned to extract ancient DNA from bone dust, from teeth, from tiny fragments of a skull. When it became possible to read the genetic code of a person who died 2,500 years ago, and compare it with the code of modern peoples. And that was when the old story began to crack. The first studies were cautious, small samples, individual burials, individual regions. But even then, something did not add up. Etruscan bones did not show a sharp connection with Anatolia. They did not look like the bones of migrants from the Far East. They looked local. These were preliminary results. They could be explained in different ways. Perhaps the sample was too small. Perhaps the migrants mixed with the locals so deeply that the eastern trace dissolved. Perhaps science did not yet see the whole picture. And then came the large studies, tens of samples. Bones from different centuries, from different cities, from different social strata. Men, women, children, aristocrats and peasants, warriors and artisans. And the picture that emerged was so unexpected that many researchers had to rewrite their lectures from scratch. The Etruscans were genetically almost indistinguishable from their neighbors, from the Latins, who would later give the world Rome, from the other Italian peoples who lived around them. Their DNA belonged to Europe. It belonged to Italy. It belonged to the same genetic landscape that had formed on the peninsula back in the Bronze Age, when steppe nomads from the northeast brought their blood and their languages to the south. That is, genetically, the Etruscans were Indo-Europeans, like the Latins, like the Celts, like the Greeks. But their language was not Indo-European, not at all. And here the story ceased to be simple. It became something much deeper than anyone expected. Because if a people genetically looks like its neighbors, but speaks a language that no one on the continent understands, then it means one of two things. Either the language came without the people, or the people forgot who they once were and remembered only the language. Imagine this for 1 minute. Imagine a people who preserved the most ancient language of Europe, a language from the times before the arrival of the Indo-European tribes, a language spoken back when Stonehenge was just beginning to be built. Imagine that this people preserved this language not because they brought it from afar, but because they never lost it. That other peoples around them switched to new languages, adopted new words, forgot old sounds. But they did not forget. Because language does not always flow together with blood. Language can live separately. Language can cling to mountains, to temples, to sacred words that people are afraid to change. Language can survive migrations, wars, conquests, if only there are enough people who will say, "We will speak the way our ancestors spoke, even if the whole world speaks differently." And this makes the Etruscans not just a mystery, it makes them witnesses. Witnesses to what Europe was before it became Indo-European. But even this is not the whole story. Because when researchers looked closer, they noticed one more detail. In some Etruscan burials, especially in later ones, traces of a different origin appeared. Small ones, subtle ones, but real ones. Traces of people who could have come from the East, from the Levant, from Anatolia, not en masse, not as a conquest, but as small streams flowing into a river. And this brought to mind something very ancient, Herodotus. His legend about the Lydian king who divided his people and sent one half across the sea. Perhaps this legend was not entirely a fiction. Perhaps it was a memory of something tiny that actually happened. Some group, perhaps noble, perhaps mercantile, perhaps religious, really did come from the East and merged into an already existing society. And this society, perhaps, adopted part of their customs, part of their beliefs, part of their stories, but not their language, and not their blood. So Herodotus was not entirely wrong either, and Dionysius was not entirely wrong either. Both saw a part of the truth. It is just that neither of them saw all of it. The old explanatory model was not useless, it was incomplete. And right at this point, the story begins to branch out. Because if the Etruscans were genetically indigenous Italians who preserved a pre-Indo-European language, then another question arises. Where did this language come from in the first place? Who spoke it before it became Etruscan? What other peoples of Europe spoke similar languages thousands of years ago, before they were washed away by waves of new arrivals from the north and east? And here other names begin to appear. Strange ones, almost forgotten ones. A people who lived on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea and left inscriptions in a language eerily similar to Etruscan. A people who lived in Raetia, high in the Alps, and left inscriptions that also echo with an Etruscan root. Peoples scattered across islands and mountains, in places that are hard to reach, in places where old languages survived longer than in the valleys. From this, an image begins to emerge. Not a clear one, not a complete one, but an image. An image of old Europe. Europe before the Indo-Europeans. A Europe of languages that we hardly know. A Europe of which only fragments remain. Inscriptions on stones, names of rivers and mountains, rare words that survived thousands of years of linguistic changes. The Etruscans, perhaps, were the last great voice of this old Europe. The last people who managed to preserve an ancient language long enough to leave behind literature, religion, civilization, cities. The last whose voice we can still hear, even though we cannot fully understand it. And when this thought settles, the picture becomes quiet, almost alarmingly quiet. Imagine the hills of Tuscany under the evening light, the soft lines of the slopes, the orange dust in the air, the narrow paths leading to old necropolises. The stones, heated during the day, begin to give off warmth, and in this warmth, one can still feel the breath of those who built the first walls here. The tombs are carved into tuff, a soft volcanic rock. The entrance is low. Inside there is coolness, dampness, the smell of earth. The walls are painted with scenes of banquets. Men and women lie side by side, holding cups in their hands, smiling. On the ceiling, branches, fish, and birds are painted. Here, death was not the end. Here, death was a transition to another celebration. And in this silence, among these colors, among the inscriptions that we can read letter by letter but cannot understand, something very old is felt. Something much older than Rome. Something that was here before the nomads from the steppe brought their chariots. Something that belonged to another Europe. A Europe of which only shadows remain. And it is exactly this silence that makes the history of the Etruscans so compelling. Because it reminds us how little we know about our own past, how easily great civilizations disappear, how quickly languages are forgotten, how fragile the legacy of a people can be when they did not leave behind an empire ready to preserve their name. The Etruscans did not leave an empire, they left an influence. They taught the Romans writing, they taught them engineering, they taught them rituals that the Romans would later call their own. The first Roman kings, according to legend, were of Etruscan origin. The very name Rome, perhaps, has an Etruscan root. Gestures, symbols, even the purple toga of a ruler, all of this came from Etruria. And then, gradually, over the centuries, the Etruscans were absorbed. Not destroyed, absorbed. Their cities became Roman. Their children began to speak Latin. Their gods mixed with the Roman gods. Their names were forgotten. Their language ceased to live in conversation and remained only on stones. By the 2nd century of our era, there likely remained only isolated experts who could still read the ancient texts. By the 3rd century, the language had probably died completely. Only inscriptions remained, silent, undeciphered, waiting for a future that was never able to fully reveal them. And here is the question that now gives no peace. If DNA shows that the Etruscans were local, and the language shows that they preserved something very ancient, then who were they really? A people? A culture? An alliance of cities united by a common tradition? The last repository of pre-Indo-European Europe? All of these at once? Perhaps the question of origin was wrong from the very beginning. Perhaps we always wanted to find a point on the map and say, this is where they are from. But peoples do not appear from points. Peoples grow from layers, from millennia of mixing, migrating, forgetting, remembering, from many threads that intertwine so tightly that it is impossible to say where one begins and another ends. The Etruscans were Italians by blood. They were something much more ancient by language. They were the creators of a new culture that absorbed influences from all over the Mediterranean. They were a bridge between the old Europe and the new. They were the last to speak with a voice that existed before almost all modern European languages existed. And there is something almost sacred in this. A people who carried a memory without knowing they carried it. A people who held the key to the locked doors of the past, not suspecting that the doors even existed. We love simple origin stories. We want to know that our ancestors came from somewhere. We want lines on a map. We want an arrow that starts in one place and ends in another. This gives us a sense of order, a sense that history has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But history does not work that way. History is not a line. It is a network. It is a web of paths that intersect and diverge, overlap one another, disappear and reappear. Every people is not a point of origin, but a crossroads. Every culture is not a tree with one root, but a forest with 1,000 roots that intertwine deep underground. The Etruscans remind us of this. They were what we always truly are, complex, layered, connected to a multitude of pasts. They were Italians and not Italians at the same time. They were ancient and new. They were familiar and alien. They were that which always eludes simple definitions. And perhaps that is exactly why their history troubles us so much. Because when we look at them, we see ourselves. People who think they know their roots, but in reality carry within themselves thousands of forgotten ancestors. People who speak languages whose history is much older than ourselves. Cultures that preserve fragments of other cultures without even realizing it. The data did not simplify the past. It made it older. What emerged was not a straight line, but a web. And then comes the last question, the quietest of all. If the Etruscans preserved such an ancient language, such an ancient layer of European memory, then how many more such layers are hiding beneath the surface of history? How many peoples whose names we know are actually descendants of other peoples whose names we do not know? How many languages that are now silent once sounded in the valleys, on the islands, in the mountains, and carried entire worlds within them? The Europe in which we live is only the newest layer. Beneath it is another, and beneath that is one more, and more, and more. Layers of languages, layers of beliefs, layers of people who came and went, leaving behind only bones, only inscriptions, only traces in our DNA that we are only now beginning to learn to read. The Etruscans were a window into this lower layer, a small, cloudy, but real window. And when we look into it, we see not one face, but many, many faces that merge into one, many stories that fold into one, many roots that stretch into the darkness of time deeper than we dared to imagine. And in the end, only silence remains. The silence of the necropolises, where lie those who once spoke a language we cannot fully understand. The silence of the hills, which remember footsteps that no one hears anymore. The silence of the stones, on which words are carved, waiting for a reader who, perhaps, will never come. The Etruscans were not who we thought they were. Not because the old story was completely false, but because it was too small, too simple for a people who carried within themselves the echo of millennia, too narrow for people who were simultaneously local and ancient, familiar and alien, Italians by blood, and older than Italy itself by the words that flew from their lips. The mystery was not solved. It was expanded. And perhaps it is exactly in this expansion, in this realization that the past is always greater than our ideas about it, that the true meaning of history hides. Not in the answers, but in how one small discovery can make the whole world deeper, more ancient, more mysterious than it was just yesterday. The Etruscans are silent. Their language is silent. Their cities stand in ruins overgrown with grass. But in this silence, something resembling a whisper is heard. The whisper of people who knew something that we no longer know. The whisper of a people who lived on the edge of two eras and carried both within themselves. And perhaps the strangest thing in this story is that it is not yet finished, because the bones continue to lie in the earth. The inscriptions continue to wait. Science continues to learn to ask new questions of the ancient, silent witnesses. And each subsequent generation of researchers, perhaps, will discover one more layer, one more thread, one more fragment of a picture that will never be complete. The Etruscans were not who we thought they were. They were more, older, more complex. And perhaps this is the most important lesson they left us. That no people is ever what it seems. That beneath every simple story lies a more complex story. That beneath every certainty waits a question, ready to change everything. The land of Tuscany is silent. The stones are silent. The bones are silent. But if you stand long enough among the old tombs, when the sun sets and the hills turn gold in the evening light, you can almost hear them speaking, not with words, but with their very presence, with the very fact that they existed, with the very weight of the millennia they traverse to reach us. And in this moment, you realize that history never ends. It only expands. It only deepens. It only opens new doors into rooms that previously seemed empty. The Etruscans passed through these doors a long time ago. They left them ajar, and now we, finally, are beginning to look inside. What we will see there is still unknown, but one thing is already clear. The world we thought we knew was only the first room, and beyond it stretches a house in which we are only beginning to orient ourselves. And in this house, the Etruscans have not disappeared. They are waiting, quietly, patiently, as they always knew how to wait. For 2,500 years, they waited for us to learn to ask the right questions. And perhaps now, finally, we are beginning to ask them. And they, perhaps, are finally beginning to answer.